Hi, y'all. Happy Friday, and welcome back to Blue Planet Week 2. Today, we are going to be talking about geological oceanography, and all week we've been kind of covering the first 4 principles of oceanography. So we've been talking about physical oceanography, and that's where we learned all about the currents and how the water moves. We talked a lot about density, and we talked about salinity and the global conveyor belt, if you remember that, way back on Monday. Tuesday, we talked about biological oceanography and we went over plankton, right? So we talked about how living things are being moved by those currents that we discussed on Monday. So we talked about phytoplankton blooms, what phytoplankton is, and we talked about zooplankton. Wednesday, we kind of had a break from our oceanography and we talked a little bit about ocean engineering. So that's when we covered our ROVs, our remote operated vehicles, and then our AUVs and ASVs. And we talked about mapping the ocean floor and all the different tasks that those pieces of equipment can perform. And then yesterday we talked about chemical oceanography. So we talked about marine chemistry, what makes the ocean so salty, and we covered a lot about ocean acidification. So those chemical processes that are being interfered with by just the introduction of more CO2 into the ocean environment. And so today, to wrap it all up, we are going to discuss geological oceanography. And so geological oceanography is going to cover, like the rest of them, just a lot of different things. But today we mainly are going to just be talking about the basics of geology and kind of what makes geological oceanography different from the rest of the principles. So let me get our PowerPoint up for you. Sorry, y'all can hear me clicking. Okay, so all of the things that we are going to cover, just like the rest of the week today, are mainly going to be focused on the Mississippi Gulf Coast and just kind of how our habitats nearby, our local habitats, are going to be unique from other habitats as well. So this is just an image, an introduction image, kind of talking about what geology is and what that can look like in the ocean. So just like the rest of the planet, like our terrestrial environments, on land, we have different landforms and different shapes that are going to make up the Earth or the Earth's crust. And so that's going to take place in the ocean as well. So at the ocean floor, you're going to have different types of structures like seamounts, right? Like underwater mountains, you're going to have trenches and things like that. And so that's going to be called topography. And so topography is just going to be the way that the land is shaped and the direction that it is going in, as well as the materials that are going to be making it up, right? That create it. So this is just like a mapped image that's showing you different elevations of a surface in the ocean seafloor. So pretty cool. I love maps. You can learn a lot just from looking at a map. So what is geology? Just basically, geology is going to be the study of the Earth, how it was formed, and how it has changed since its formation, as well as the materials that create it and the processes that act on it. So in geology, you're going to be looking at how everything has just happened over time. And that is going to be a very, very, very long span of time. We're talking like millions and billions of years, right? So how the Earth continents were arranged in the very beginning, how they are drifting, looking at plate tectonics, right? And so it's also going to look at the substances and the materials that make up the continents, right? So pretty much any type of rock, any type of sand, any type of clay. So they're going to be analyzing those things. And then you can kind of look at what's inside of the rock, the clay, or just that stratification of sediment. And you can learn lots of different things about what happened throughout those millions and billions of years. And so those are the processes. So you're going to learn about if a major flood happened, you can tell that just based on looking at a sediment core that went down far enough, right, into the ground. And so you can learn about floods, you can learn about pollution, any type of chemical substance that has been absorbed into the dirt, or any type of biological phenomenon that occurred at a specific time, right? Like evolution, anything like that. You can learn a lot just from looking at geological samples. But what is marine geology specifically? So marine geology is going to be the study of the ocean floor. So the shallower slopes and shelves that surround the continents, as well as coastal areas such as beaches and estuaries. So pretty much looking at just the ocean floor, how it's developed. And once you look at coastal areas, you can look at how beaches are formed and what makes a beach, and just kind of how they're going to be changing throughout time. So that being said, how is a beach formed? So there are man-made beaches, and then there are natural beaches. And so a natural beach is going to be formed as waves deposit sand and gravel along a shoreline in just repeated motions, right? So some beaches are going to be made from rocks and pebbles rather than sand. So the classification of these things is going to be based on their size, and the material that the beach is made up of is usually going to represent the local geology of that region. So even beaches that are made of sand, right, there's going to be a variety in the type of sand that is present at that beach. And that sand can represent your local geology as well as geology from other places because of the currents moving all of that material in the water. And so the rocks that are going to be present are usually going to be worn down by the waves and kind of smooth. So they're going to be those really good skipping rocks, if you will. So sand beaches can vary in color according to the types of minerals that are found in each grain. So volcanic sand, for example, is going to look black, and then quartz sand is going to look white. And that's just two very, very broad categories of the sand. So it can vary in color, and it's going to vary in grain size, as well as just like the shape of the sand. Is it going to be chiseled? Is it going to be smooth on the outside? And then you can look at the individual granules and know if it's smooth, that it has endured a lot of water, or if it's really jagged, then you can tell that it hasn't been eroded as much, or things like that, just based on the sand and the dirt. So how is a beach traditionally formed with the ocean? So the stratification of your sand is going to represent the different years, right? So you have your Holocene sand, and then you have your Pleistocene sand, and below that you have bedrock, and then there's different mounds that can be formed, and then you have dunes, right, that are going to be forming up closer in the upland, right? And so you can kind of look at that and age your sand, and that will help you learn more about how old that specific location is, like how old that sand is. Will tell you a lot about the formation of that specific island or a specific beach, or whatever it is that you are sampling on. And so the beach forming process is going to look kind of like this. So I mentioned earlier that those waves are going to be depositing the sand upland. So what's happening is the sand from the ocean floor is basically being dug out by the waves and then repositioned somewhere else. It's being displaced. So as the waves are coming inshore, it's going to take sand away and then put sand back. And so this pretty much just happens over and over and over again. And over the course of an hour, you can even see a change in the shape and the formation of your beach. And then as time goes on, that beach is going to change even more. I mentioned that we do have man-made beaches, so we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But your natural beaches are going to be made by this process of just the wind moving the water and then the waves kind of acting on that sediment. So you can kind of get dunes formed from that as well. And then the wind blows over the dune and you get more dunes. So all these environmental processes are going to change the shape and the forms of your beaches. So this is a slide that I put in to kind of help us understand a little bit more about the differences in our sediment and just kind of give you an illustration of those angles that we were talking about previously. So we have sediment grain size. There's a whole scale for that, and it gets very, very small, right? You can get down to like less than 1 millimeter of a grain size. And so each of those are going to be classified differently. So your gravel is going to be larger, right? Bigger grains. And then you can get more coarse, right? And then, so sand is just one type of sediment. It does encompass most of your grain sizes, but there's also going to be other grain sizes that are going to be relevant as well. So things like silt is going to be a super small grain size. It's still going to be kind of gritty, but you'll be able to see those individual grains. So that's going to be different from clay. Clay is going to be no visible grains. It's almost going to just look solid, and it doesn't necessarily like grind in your hands if you were to do this with it, whatever this is called. And then you have even larger things that get into like boulders and stuff. But yeah, so we're mainly going to be talking about sand today because that's what mostly makes up our beaches. So here's just some different classifications of your shapes. And this stuff is very important, like I said earlier, because it will tell you a lot about just the environmental processes and what has been happening in that general region. So if you're sitting here thinking that looking at different angles on individual grains of sand is useless, it's not, because it can tell you so much about the climate and the weather and just the environment itself. So here's just some different very angular or angular, subangular, subrounded, and there's multiple different ways of classifying it based on shape. This is just one image that I found, but in different scientific papers they may have different names for these. And then you have assortments basically of all of those grain sizes. So you can have sediment that is well sorted or very well sorted, moderately sorted, poorly sorted, or very poorly sorted. And so that's going to kind of be based on just like the average grain size of your sediment. So if you are seeing a lot of variation in your sizes, it's going to alter the quality of your sort. So things that are going to be well sorted are going to have pretty much the same grain sizes overall, just like in general, and then you're going to have some variation in your your poorly sorted ones. So why do we care about the way that the sediment is sorted? Why do we care if they're the same size or if they're not? Why does it matter? So it's going to alter the way that water is filtering through those specific sediment samples. So it will tell you a lot about if a specific region is prone to flooding, for example, if the water can just passes through that sediment, or if the water is going to be absorbed and staying in that sediment. So that's just one example of where it would matter for us, like for humans. And then it can also help you figure out if it's going to erode easily or if it's kind of, a little bit more stable. So that can come into use whenever you're talking about like our wetlands, or even like just islands, like barrier islands that are going to be moving pretty routinely. So the sortedness of your sample really matters. And so these are just a couple of different types of sand that I found when I was researching this. So there's really lots of different colors of sand. So this is desert sand in Mongolia. And so there's all these different colors and these different shapes. And so that's going to tell you that there's a lot of different types of minerals in there because they're all being represented differently, right, in color. So there's a lot of variation here. This is going to be volcanic sand in Greece, and it's going to be volcanic sand is usually going to be darker and black because of it's just been around so much heat, fire, lava, those kinds of things. And so it's going to kind of make it black on the outside and kind of tar it a little bit. Olivine sand, this is in Hawaii, and it is very green in color. I think Hawaii also has some pink, or maybe that's Australia. I haven't been to either of those places, but there is some other fun colors out there too. This is some pink coral sand from Bermuda. So over here in this first image, we were looking at sand that was just made from different types of rocks, right? And here, these two are going to be sands that have actually been made from living things. So your pink coral sand is going to be coming from coral. And so if you think about your coral reefs and just the regions where those are going to be in your water, they're going to usually be closer inland, right, to where just on the continental shelf, right? So off the continental shelf, you have that big drop off where it gets super deep. So these corals are going to be in the more shallow parts of the water. And so they're going to be very prone to breakage from waves. And there's going to be a lot of wind in those areas as well. And so those corals are going to break up and then it can be deposited onto the beach. And so you have pink coral sand. This is foraminifera sand. So a foram or a foraminifera is going to be a type of plankton. And these guys actually grow like a little test around them. So basically like a small shell. And if you remember from yesterday, we talked a lot about our shell building organisms, and they're going to be using the calcium carbonate in order to build their shells. Well, the forams are also going to be using calcium carbonate, and that's what is constructing all of these different shapes of sand grains that you see here. Corals are also going to be using that calcium carbonate too. But your forams have all these different shapes and sizes, and they are very abundant just because they're plankton, right? So there's lots of them. And I can't even imagine going to a beach of literally just forams. That would be so cool. Let me know if any of you have been to a foraminifera beach. Type it in the chat. I want to know. All right. So what about Mississippi beaches? Do we think that Mississippi beaches are man-made, or do we think that they are naturally made? So this is just an image of our Mississippi Gulf Coast, and you kind of look at that for a little bit and see. So the Mississippi Gulf Coast has the largest man-made beach in the world. So it is man-made. This is not a natural forming beach. And there's a couple of different ways you can tell just from looking at this image. So you can tell from the way that the sand is eroding. And you can also tell from the distance from the road to the beach. So naturally formed beaches are usually going to have way more sand, and it's going to take longer to get down to the water. There's also going to be a little bit more variation in elevation. So our beaches are going to be kind of more flat here, and that is because they are man-made. So where does the sand come from? So how did we make a man-made beach? Let me see what my next slide is. I'll go back to this one. So we make a man-made beach by something that's called dredging. And if you remember from some of our other lessons, we are located at the Mississippi Sound. And so the Mississippi Sound is going to be a shallower body of water. It's going to be 10 to 15 feet deep on average. And the dredging is going to be taking place in the Sound and then also in the Gulf of Mexico. I have a map of this that we can look at later on in these slides, but dredging is going to be basically like a large pump system that is going to be on a barge. And then so the barge will go wherever it needs to dredge, and the pump will pump sand out, and then eventually they will relocate it to wherever they want to put the sand. So it could be along beaches, or it could be along the barrier islands. So there was a restoration project that we will talk about later on when we look at our map that has to do with putting sand from the Mississippi Sound and restoring an island. So why do we dredge? Well, there's a couple of different reasons. For one, we need to dredge in order to get big ships to come into our ports. So the port of Gulfport is a very, very essential port to the whole country. Pretty much every banana in the country comes through the port of Gulfport. So like Chiquita and Dole, they all have barges that are coming in from South America. And those bananas are being brought to Gulfport. And so if we had a 10 to 15 foot depth in that region, then we wouldn't be able to get those big shipments in. So we have to dredge channels to make it deeper than 10 to 15 feet so that big barges and big ships can come in and deliver our bananas. And it's not just bananas. We have lots of seafood things that are going to be taking place that we need big boats for as well. So these are some different structures that can be put in place to prevent erosion. And so there's something called a living shoreline, and then there's coastal structures. So living shorelines are going to be pretty much your most friendly, so environmentally friendly solution to erosion prevention. So you have vegetation only. So this is going to be if you were putting in like marsh grass or something like that, and that's going to provide a buffer to your upland areas. So it breaks up small waves. And this is going to be good for like bayou environments and like just places where there's not a lot of current or wave action happening. Edging is going to be kind of similar. So you have your grasses in place, but you also have a wooded or a stone structure in with it. So your sills are going to be kind of similar to edging, but this is going to be the stone version. And then you have a breakwater. So breakwater is going to be grass as well. So marsh grass, perhaps, and then some cement or like cinder blocks or rocks or anything like that in kind of a little bit farther off of the grasses, and that's going to prevent wave energy from interfering with your coastline as well. Then you have revetment, and revetment is going to be like just straight up limestone or straight up concrete. So really no plants involved here. You're just going to have kind of this more abrasive structure along those lines of the shore. And then you also have a bulkhead, which is going to be the most invasive technique. And this is going to be like a vertical wall that is just going to be parallel to the shore. And it's literally there just to keep all the soil inside and to keep all the dirt in there. So that's going to be a little bit more harsh than the rest of them. But if you think about like seawalls or things like that, we have a lot of seawalls. So it's kind of similar to a bulkhead where you have like just a concrete wall that's like, 4 or 5 feet tall, however tall. And that's just preventing the water from coming up into the established areas. This here is kind of another example of a living shoreline. We looked at this image back on our biological oceanography day, but this one is just an oyster reef, and it's very, very large, but there's a lot of research being done with using oyster reefs as a natural preventative to erosion, basically. And so it's kind of like a twofold thing where you have your oyster reefs. So you're getting to harvest oysters, but then you're also preventing erosion in places where you don't want the sand to go away. This here is the Mississippi Sound. So this is what I was talking about before. So here, pretty much from Henderson Point, which is going to be right here in past Christian, all the way down to Biloxi. That's going to be your 26 miles of beach. So that's the stuff that we have dredged and then put down to create our beaches. And we create beaches for, several different reasons. For one, we need a place for the sand to go once we dredge it. And also for two, it's a tourist attraction and people will come contribute to our economy if we have nice beaches for them to visit. And then also just for locals, right? We wouldn't have the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Our whole culture would be completely different if we didn't have the beach. And so it is a lot of recreational. There's recreational significance, there's cultural significance, there's economical significance, and environmental as well. So this is the Gulf Islands National Seashore. That's actually where the Marine Education Center is located. But this body of water right here, this is the Mississippi Sound. So the reason why it's going to be so calm here is because you have these barrier islands. And the barrier islands are going to be preventing the currents and the waves from getting into the sound. And so it's going to be calm and it's going to be shallow. So these are barrier islands. They're called barrier islands because they protect us from hurricanes and big storms. And they also have to be parallel to the shore in order to be considered a barrier island. So if you're thinking about Biloxi, this is Deer Island right here. So Deer Island, a lot of people think it's a barrier island, but it's not because it used to be a peninsula. So it used to be connected to Biloxi and then it eroded away. So now it's no longer connected, but it's not 10 to 15 miles offshore and it's not parallel to the shore. So it's not classified as a barrier island, even though it is an island. So we have Cat Island, which is going to be a little bit further inland than the rest of them. And Cat Island is going to be, because of that, it's going to have a lot more freshwater input. And so it's going to be able to have trees on it. And the water there is going to be a little bit more like the water you would see in a bayou. So a little bit more muddy and slow and brown, just from all the sediment that's coming in from our rivers. Ship Island, this is Ship Island right here. I don't know why it's not labeled, but this is Ship Island. We'll talk about that in a second. Horn Island is a little bit bigger, and this is where Walter Anderson used to paddle his canoe out to. He's a famous artist from from New Orleans, from the Mississippi Gulf Coast. It's all kind of the same thing around here. And so Horn Island is where he used to go for weeks at a time to paint nature. So he would paint different marsh grasses and he would paint lots and lots of pelicans. And he's got a lot of just really a signature kind of unique painting style. So he's a huge influence in like the Ocean Springs area. And then there's Petty Boy Island over here as well. So Ship Island is the one that we're going to talk about more because if you look at this Google Earth image here, you can see that Ship Island is in two pieces. So Ship Island had kind of been broken up and eroded a little bit in Hurricane Katrina. And so there's actually a fort on that island called Fort of Massachusetts, and it was used in the Civil War. And so Ship Island was in two pieces, and it's probably our biggest tourist attraction island-wise from our barrier islands. There's a ferry that leaves from Gulfport and Biloxi, and they take visitors out to Ship Island all the time. And so it was in two pieces. And so what we did was we dredged from the Gulf of Mexico and from the Mississippi Sound, and they restored Ship Island. So even though in this image it's still split in two, it's actually all one island again. And so that is one way of dredging being used just in our local environment. And why do we want Ship Island to be back in one piece? Because normally barrier islands are going to migrate from east to west on their own. That's just a natural occurrence. And they're going to erode and change shape just from being next to the ocean all the time, right? So it's better for it to be all one for now, just because, well, we just talked about tourism, right? That's a big part of it, but also to protect us from future storms as well. Because if we didn't have our barrier islands, then the mainland would take a bigger hit from storm surge and just hurricanes in general. So in geology, you're also going to be looking a lot at different time periods. And so geology will really, if you are interested in history and interested in the environment, you should consider geology because it's basically looking at the history of the environment. And so GA means billions of years. So this is looking 4.5 billions of years ago. And so eons are going to be the most broad and general kind of classification of time. So here are the eons, right? And then it gets more specific. You go into your Paleozoic era and your Mesozoic era, and then you get into periods. And so what is breaking all of these things up? Why do we have so many different specifications for these time periods? So a lot of it is going to be just the cycles of the Earth. So we're looking at things like ice ages, as well as like Pangea, right? So when did the continents start to move? When were they all together? And you're just going to be looking at just the history of the Earth and what major events happened in order to break up or distinguish one time period from another. And then you also get into just the formation of life. So when was it that eukaryotes were first originated, right? And so you kind of start to break it up based on just the development of biology over periods of time. So it kind of starts off without biology being a thing, right? Existing without life. And then it shows just the progression of intricacy and complexity in our planet, basically. So today we are in the Holocene epoch, in the Quaternary period, in the Cenozoic era, and the Phanerozoic eon. So pretty cool, just to see how all of this works. And then look, there's even a Mississippian. That's us. So kind of going into a little bit of detail of what happened locally for us. So when all of the continents were together in Pangea, they eventually split apart based off of like tectonic movement, right? And so whenever that happened, there was actually a mountain range or two mountain ranges that were kind of crossing over in the Mississippi region. So that was the Wichita Mountain Range and the Appalachian Mountain Range. And so it's kind of weird to think about it that the Mississippi area, Mississippi region was actually mountainous at one point, because it doesn't look like we have mountains at all here. But so these two mountain ranges basically were kind of colliding. And so there was also a hot spot in the Earth's crust. So basically just this spot where there was like a lot of heat and a lot of thermal energy. And so when these mountain ranges kind of collided, there was also this hot spot that was causing them to sink. So basically the Earth kind of sank in that spot, and it created, just like with our sediment and also just like landform wise, it created our local Mississippi area. And so the Mississippi River was formed, and then that's where a lot of like our Mississippi Delta comes from. So the Mississippi Delta has a completely different type of soil than the rest of Mississippi. There's all these different regions and types of soil that are found in Mississippi. If any of you have ever been to Red Bluff before, that's going to be like the lowest type of soil, LOESS. So that is going to be like a red dirt that is really, really fine. And it erodes super, super easily. So that's why we pretty much have like a random canyon in the middle of Mississippi, because it's made of that different type of soil. And the Mississippi Delta is going to have a very, very rich and nutrient rich type of soil. And all this is going to be coming from this occurrence that happened with the Wichita Appalachian Mountain Ranges, which is super, super cool. And there's a lot of theories about how this happened. And it's being studied very heavily. So pretty much the sand that we have in the Mississippi Sound is going to be from those mountain ranges. And so that's where a lot of our dirt is coming from. It came from just moving down through the Mississippi River and through other rivers and systems that were just kind of eroding a lot of the sediment from those ancient land formations. So super, super interesting. If you're interested in any of this stuff at all, I would definitely recommend like going into geology or geography even, where you can learn about all these things, and then people start to map them out, and it just is super fascinating. So there's a geography degree at Mississippi or at University of Southern Mississippi, as well as a geology degree. And then there's marine geology as well. So all of it is very fascinating. And if you're interested in any of it, I would recommend pursuing it because there's a lot of opportunity there. So that pretty much concludes my marine geology, geological oceanography lesson. So this is it for our 1 o'clock session. If you have any questions, please pop them into the chat box for me, and I will try to answer them as best as I can. And yeah, thank you for joining us. Like I said previously, if you enjoyed this week, please contact us, email us, contact us on our Facebook page or our Instagram account. If you did any of the experiments, like the experiment we had on Monday, with the global conveyor belt, if you did that or are still looking into doing that, please post pictures of it, let us know. And yeah, I've really, really enjoyed working with you all, and we will be back for 3 o'clock. We have a guest speaker. His name is Dr. Davin Wallace, and he works with marine geology at the University of Southern Mississippi in the Marine Science Department. So he is a great speaker and has a really cool research, and he's doing lots of really cool things. So please join us again at 3 o'clock if you would like to learn some more about marine geology. But other than that, I will see y'all then. So thanks, guys. All right, welcome back, everyone, to our Friday of Blue Planet virtual summer camp. So we have been talking all week about oceanography and ocean engineering. It has been a very knowledge-filled week. I've learned a lot, and I hope you all have learned a lot as well. Today we talked about geological oceanography, and we went over just different basic geological concepts as far as like grain sizes, and then the geological time scale, and just your average geology things. And we talked a little bit about some barrier islands, and as well as like how they sample for geology and things like that. So we have a couple poll questions for you to just recap on what we discussed to see how much you learned in our 1 o'clock session. So we talked about sand and different types of sand. So based on our images that we looked at earlier, what color can sand be? lots of options here: brown, black, white, green, pink, or any color. We had brown for one person, and then 2 other people said any color. So any color is the correct answer. Sand can be a variety of different colors depending on what it's made from. So it can have lots of different minerals in it that are going to control the color and the pigment. So if it's like volcanic sand, it's going to be darker. And then you also have lots of sand that are going to be made from like living organisms. So like pink coral sand is going to be pink. And those are some of the images that we looked at today. We also talked about barrier islands, and I don't know if I mentioned this specifically in my talk today, but we did look at a Google Earth image, and I talked about some of our barrier islands. And in the image, how many islands did we have? There was one missing from the image, actually, but go ahead and tell me how many islands Mississippi has. 4, good. So there were 4 in the image. So we had Cat Island, which was one that was kind of inland a little bit more with the more fresh water and then the trees. And then we also had Ship Island, Petty Boy Island, and Horn Island, which is the one that Walter Anderson got a lot of his artwork inspiration from. And then we also have Chandelier Island, which is going to be kind of off the coast of Louisiana, but it's going to be bordering us from hurricanes and things as well. So for our 3 o'clock session today, we have Dr. Davin Wallace with us, and he works at the Marine Science Department at Stennis, and he is a geological scientist. So he's going to be talking to us about his research today and just kind of some different careers that you could pursue in geological oceanography. And we are excited to have you. So thank you for joining us today, Davin, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
That's great. Thanks very much for the intro, Galen. And yes, I'm going to be talking to you about what I do as a geological oceanography at the University of Southern Mississippi. As I do that, I'm going to share my screen. There we are. Can somebody confirm that they can see? You can see it?
Yep, we can see it. Looks great.
That's great. Thank you. Awesome. And I should ask too, how many can you tell me how many people are here today? Do we have like a ballpark number?
Yes, we have 3 attendees at the moment.
That's great. Okay. So what I'll say here is how I became a geological oceanographer and why it is my dream job. So I'm at the University of Southern Mississippi as a professor in the School of Ocean Science and Engineering, associate professor. And I'll tell you a little bit about my career path and how I got to be here, what it means to be a geological oceanographer, why it's my dream job, and how I guess got to be in this position. And I'll apologize in advance if you hear a small crying in the background. I have a 2-month-old daughter who is in the other room, and things aren't going well with her right now in terms of why she's crying. But I'm sure she'll be fine here in a second. So she's a little upset about something, but I apologize for that. So. My story starts with an event in 2005 called Hurricane Katrina. I'm sure many of you maybe weren't alive during this. Some of you maybe were. But this event was profoundly important for so many people that lived along the Gulf Coast in a devastating way. And I was included in that. In 2005, I was actually an undergraduate at Tulane University, which is in New Orleans. I'm sure you've heard many stories about it if you didn't live through Katrina, of the devastation that was caused in New Orleans and South Mississippi and even into Alabama. But my story starts with this. As I was an undergrad at Tulane, I was displaced during this event, and I moved to Houston for a semester, where I went to graduate school at Rice University. And I'll show you all this here in a second. But my story really starts in 2005 with Katrina. I was studying earth science. I was really interested in the planet, and I was studying that, although I was trying to figure out exactly what I wanted to do specifically moving forward. And this event changed my life in the sense that I lived through the hurricane. But I started asking myself questions about how often do these types of events like Katrina happen? You know, do they happen every 5 years, every 10 years, et cetera? And this is an image basically of 150, 160 years worth of hurricane impacts and pathways by which storms can travel. And you can see that, you know, the area that initially I was kind of, what I just showed you, the previous image, you know, the Louisiana, New Orleans, Mississippi, Alabama area right here, definitely in an area where you get a lot of these yellow storms, which are category 3 and higher based on wind speeds. But what I noticed is that this record reliably is 150 years long. So that may seem very long to all of you, and by, you know, human lifetime scales is very long. But from a statistical standpoint, events that happen very infrequently, like major events like Katrina, you really need a longer time series than 150 years. And that's where geology came into play. And how can we use the longer term tape recorder of our environment around us to determine how often these events happen? And so this is the question that I asked myself back in 2005. And interestingly, it's still one of the main driving questions that I'm working on to this day. And so, of course, what happened during Katrina in the Mississippi Gulf Coast was not something that, even though it was very unfortunate, it was not necessarily that surprising in the sense that we sort of knew that the area, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas, for example, all places that I have lived now, the coastlines are quite vulnerable. And what's shown here is actually in red is the USGS, or the US Geological Survey, their assessment of risk associated with sea level rise, which you've probably heard of, associated with climate change, is a very important factor for us in terms of how we are going to actually have sustainable coasts. You can see that we have we have high vulnerability, basically from the Texas-Mexican border all the way to Florida, essentially, in red. And so I wanted to understand storms that I had just gone through in my own life, that kind of motivated it. And I wanted to understand how often they can happen, those events can happen. And in addition to that, how those feed into vulnerable coasts. So we, you know, the majority of the world's population lives pretty close to the ocean. People love living by the ocean. It's important for navigation. It's important for you know, tourism and economy. And so lots of people live by the coast. Yet there are many locations around the world that are quite vulnerable. And if I jump back to my hurricane map, one of the things that I always like to show people, if you've not seen this kind of image before, is, you know, in the Gulf of Mexico, Caribbean, and Eastern Seaboard, you know, find me a place where over the last 150 years there hasn't been a hurricane strike, you know. And you'll be pretty hard pressed to find an area that you know, has not had some influence. And keep in mind, these are just the tracks, so they're super skinny. But hurricanes, of course, are hundreds of miles wide in terms of, or can be hundreds of miles wide in terms of their radius. So, so this is a hazard that affects pretty much everyone, at least in the North Atlantic. So here's my story. So as I mentioned, in 2005, I was at Tulane University in New Orleans, Louisiana, where I was studying actually geology and German. And so I was, you know, figuring out really about the world and scientifically what I could investigate, because I was interested in so many things, and Hurricane Katrina solidified that. I then went to Rice University for a PhD in earth science, and I'm from Houston originally, so that was a little bit of a homecoming in terms of going back. My parents lived there, and after that, I went to do a postdoc, which is basically when you're not a student anymore, but you're not a professor, you're sort of doing additional training at a place called the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and the University of Massachusetts Amherst jointly. And then I came back to become a professor here at the University of Southern Mississippi. So I kind of bounced around to all of these places. Being a geological oceanographer for me, which I focused on those problems that I mentioned to you, things like sea level rise, hurricanes, understanding coastlines, has brought me very fortunately to lots of really interesting and neat places around the world. So here's just a couple of the locations that my work has brought me in. And that's a really important and for me, exciting part of my job, to be able to travel and do field work. I mean, of course, right now things are crazy with COVID, and traveling seems like something that we may never get to do again, but we will in due time. And before that, though, these are the places that I've got to go to around the world. Lots of locations in the Gulf of Mexico, the Eastern Seaboard, Bermuda, which is an island in the North Atlantic, Washington, Morocco and Africa, Chile, South America, Antarctica. I'll show you some pictures from some of these places as well. Japan, the Philippines, and New Zealand. So lots of really cool places that I've been able to go and conduct studies. And what I do in some of these places, here's an example of actually when I was an undergrad in New Orleans at Tulane back in 2005. We take a lot of things like sediment cores. So sediment cores, if you're not familiar with what they are, they're essentially pushing a tube into the ground. You pull that tube up, and then you have a nice record of what the sediment actually looks like. We can go actually quite deep with this, with even just with a hand, by hand. You can keep pushing it down in kind of meter-long increments. Also, I want to mention to you, if you have any questions at any point, just jump in the chat window. Don't feel like I, need to, open it up for questions or anything. And I've kind of lost my chat window, so if Galen or anyone else can let me know if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Just jump in at any point. I had a lot of coffee today, okay, so my monologue can easily be interrupted. And I encourage you to do so, because I want this to be as interactive as possible. But yeah, so going back to the work here, we were working in New Orleans here, looking at actually how fast the city was sinking. That was the goal of what we were trying to do, is look at that. And so what we did, collected a bunch of cores, looked at the sedimentary layers to see how it was sinking, doing things like GPS, so understanding exactly where we were and what the exact elevation is of the point that we were was really important. And these are some of the methods that we use in geological oceanography. Sorry, I'm just kind of toggling here. This is an example of one of the cores that we collected. So you can see kind of what the layers are that we're sort of looking for. You can see peat is a swamp deposit. So peat is a swamp deposit that is ancient. And if you look at it under a microscope, you can see things like freshwater plants that have associated seeds with that. And then you can see things like clay. And so how fast this layer squishes and squeezes is how fast the city, or in this location at least, things are sinking. So this is the kind of thing that we do or did at the time when I was doing this research. Here's another example of in South Padre Island what the environment looks like. This is me with my my PhD advisor, John Anderson. So here's where we are here in the red dot, and where we were for this particular part of my PhD dissertation was looking at a wonderful place called Laguna Madre, which is the lagoon behind South Padre Island, which you might have heard of as a popular kind of destination for vacations. And we took a whole bunch of sediment cores in that particular area. Sediment core here, not the hand coring. This is called the vibrocore. So you can see that the hollow aluminum tube is connected to a concrete motor, which is actually vibrating. And what it does is it vibrates, and it basically vibrates the core into the ground. And by the way, I'm pulling it out of the ground here. It's not actually on while it's vibrating. And we have, of course, this tripod to help us pull it out of the ground. So this is it going into the ground. So we get to do a lot of boat work, Lots of water work, lots of land work. It's all really fun. But coring is a big important part of our method. And if you've never seen a sediment core, these are kind of what they look like. You have that hollow aluminum tube like this. It comes back up out of the ground, and you cut it open with a saw. And when you do that, you find wonderful things like this as well, where you have different layers, different colors of the layers, different stiffness. This is, for example, sand versus clay. This is an important geologic boundary that is about 12 or so thousand years old. And we can find things like logs and trees that tell us all about the paleo environment of this past site. And these are actually some cores that we worked on that were collected in and around Petty Boy Island, which I understand from your quiz, you know where it is and counted it as one of the islands of Mississippi. So this is actually offshore. So we can collect these cores on land in the near shore, like in water that you can wade into, and water depths all the way up to, thousands of feet. But what I work in is about 60, 70, 80, 90 meters of water. So anything within that. Another important tool for being a geological oceanographer is seismic, what's called seismic or geophysics. So without going into too much detail, these are some of the boats that we have at the University of Southern Mississippi. This is called the RV Jim Franks, and this is called the RV Point Sur. This is 135 feet, I think, and this is about 40 or 50 feet in length, stern to bow. And we have here a variety of different geophysical things that, in this case, we can actually tow behind the boat. Okay. We have what's called well, number one, if you follow that, that's a multi-beam. So it's actually a scan with lasers of a swath of a cone that looks like this that actually shows us what the bottom looks like. So what's the elevation of the bottom or the bathymetry. We can look at something like a side scan sonar, which is just like a picture. But what I normally do is focus on this 4 and 5, which is the chirp, and which is a sub-bottom profiler. So we shoot acoustic waves into the subsurface, and based on the return time of those acoustic waves, we can actually determine what the subsurface looks like. And so that's what's kind of shown here in these black and white lines. These are different velocities based on the different density of what the material sort of looks like. The speed of the material, we can actually reconstruct what is below the sediment. And that's what the geology is. That's what being a geological oceanographer is all about. So we're not looking again at what's in the water or what's on the bottom. We're actually looking here at what is below the sediment water interface. Another thing that we use is called a boomer. And that is just a little metal plate that flexes and makes a sound that's about like an aluminum can that's empty, like crinkling it. If you can imagine, if you had an empty can in a swimming pool, you were crinkling it underwater, and what that noise sort of sounds like is about what the boomer does. But the hydrophone, or the ears that listen for the signal to return, are so sensitive they can hear very, very minor changes in those velocity just from a sound wave of a can essentially crinkling. So it's very, very sensitive equipment, but it's quite nice, and it allows us to really get very deep. We look in the upper like 20 or 30 feet, below the sediment. But oil and gas, like being a geologist for an oil and gas company, like Exxon or Shell or Chevron, you've seen those gas stations. They look for oil and gas like miles below the surface, and they use similar type instruments. At least the physics is the same. And here's what those things look like, at least the ones that we use. This is the chirp. This is the boomer and the plate that gets towed behind the boat. And here's what a side scan looks like. So this is about 2 or 3 feet long, 1 or 2 feet wide. This is like 3 or 4 feet long, 1 or 2 feet wide. So these are fairly small, manageable. You can work them. You can use them on small boats and stuff. I am very fortunate. One of the best parts of my job, being a geological oceanographer, I guess it's more being at a university and being professor is that I get to work with graduate students. So graduate students are ones that are, you've completed your undergrad, so you go to college for, 3-4 years, you get an undergraduate degree, and then you can go to graduate school after that to get either a master's or a PhD. And so these are all of my my current students that I get to work with, and it's a really wonderful part of my job to work with those students and see them get master's and PhD degrees. We have, we work really hard, but we also have a lot of fun. We get to do a lot of field work. They participate and lead a lot of it, and work together as a team. So yeah, it's a really fun part of what I get to do. So another thing that I am, one of the sites that I've worked in as we're kind of going through this is Bermuda. So I showed that to you on the map. So this is a really cool place. It's an island that's out in the middle of the North Atlantic. It's about 1,500 miles off the coast of North Carolina. And one of the things that we're looking at here, you can see a panorama basically from the Atlantic Ocean to this pond that you see in the shoreline here. This black stuff that you see in the nice blue water is actually coral reef. It's just what it looks like. And then the white stuff that you see here is actually sand in the near shore. Then you have these giant boulders, which are limestone, and they're actually black. And limestone, as you may or may not know, is actually it's more or less a white or a gray rock. And when it gets black like this, it looks like a volcanic rock, but it's not. It's actually just lichens and stuff that are growing, so organisms that are growing there. And actually, you can see the places where it's been eroded from storms. It's that kind of grayish, whitish color that you see below. So kind of an interesting thing that we call chemical weathering, but you can see that quite nice here. And one of the things that we were doing in this one is to actually reconstruct hurricanes. So you get this sand, okay, that's in the reef environment. Then you have this pond right here. And this pond doesn't get any sand unless there's a major storm that comes. And if you can look at this little cartoon image here, I have the reef, so that's this, the boulders, that's this, and then the lagoon, which is this. So during storms, the sand gets transported from this area right here over the boulders into this little pond. And so if we can track those sand layers and date them, then we actually have a nice record of what hurricanes actually look like in this particular area. So pretty exciting project that we have there. Another thing that I've been fortunate to, another place that we've been fortunate to go to, when I was a first-year graduate student at Rice, I was fortunate enough to go to Antarctica, where I was part of a study where we were looking at climate change, global change, and how the past kind of glacial history of the ice sheets in Antarctica in and around what's called the peninsula. So on this map, you can see where we are up here, way down in the southern hemisphere is Antarctica, of course. And the peninsula is that piece that sticks out that's actually closest to South America. So what we did is we flew to Chile, took a boat, and then took that boat called the Nathaniel B Palmer, which I'll show you in the next slide here, to the peninsula, which I've circled here. And of course, if you melted Antarctica, you would raise sea level about 160 feet, higher than what it is today around the world. Now, I'm not saying at all that that's going to happen in our lifetime, that 160 feet. But what I am saying is that there's a lot of ice and a lot of water potentially that can be added to the planet to continue to raise sea levels as they have been due to human-based climate change. So one of the parts of this study, which I was participating in, I wasn't necessarily leading or anything. I was just a kind of a student helper. Was to basically understand the past history of the ice sheet to understand how climate change may change in the future. So what record can we see? And so we set out to study that. And so here's some pictures. This is the Nathaniel B Palmer, as I mentioned, the icebreaker. It's like a 300-foot vessel. This has a, it's pretty flat, which is basically the bottom is flat. It's designed to break through ice. So we'll be going through ice in the ocean, and this hull is like 10 times the thickness of a regular hull. And it's designed to actually break through the ice in order to push through. We saw things like humpback whales, which was pretty cool. Penguins, of course, playing on an iceberg. This is like a picturesque thing. And here's me as a first-year grad student with some of my other colleagues, and you can see the mountains of Antarctica in the background, standing on the deck here. It's pretty neat. And some more pictures of icebergs and mountains and stuff. This is another core, different type of core that we use to look at the geologic history. This one is like a dart, basically. It's like a tube, but you put a bunch of weights on the top, which you can see here, the kind of wider part that is down here that you throw overboard, essentially like this, and it's like a dart. It just goes whoop, and then as far as it gets with that, momentum with the weights is how deep of a core you get. So that is that. And another great part of my job is that being a geological oceanographer is aside from doing all of this traveling and field work, I get to do a lot of field trips with students, with teachers, with professors, with all sorts of different, types of people, as well as different age groups. And that brings us to a lot of nice places where we get to sort of see the geology, which is so important in earth science, is to get out into nature, which is the natural lab, to be able to kind of formulate questions and hypotheses that you might want to investigate. So, I wanted to sort of give you just a very broad sense of what I do, but being a geologist and being a geological oceanographer is a very broad science, as you might imagine. There's so many different things that you can do to study the Earth and looking at the geologic record. And I've tended to focus on how I can essentially use past information to help us better understand coastal hazards moving forward in the future, just because it was a very important part of my life and just really interesting me. So that was kind of all the general material that I had prepared here to go over. But I am more than happy to hopefully answer some of your questions.
Thank you for your presentation. I had a few questions. I was wondering, we were talking about the Wichita Appalachian Mountain Range and its influence on just the formation of Mississippi and like some of our geology around here. Have you done any work with that?
With the Appalachians in particular, or with?
Yeah, just with how the like Mississippi embayment and the geology is like seen down here now with just the change in formations over time.
Yeah, that's a good question. I have not looked at that. I should also clarify, I've worked on the last, the Earth is 4.56 billion years old. And I've worked on the last 150,000 years and younger. So I work on minutes, time scales of minutes and seconds and hours to 150,000 years, which is a long time.
Right.
But it's nowhere near the length of the the planet Earth. And I think probably the questions you're asking, which are very good, are kind of more on the million year time scales. Yeah. So, but I do know that lots of people have looked at that, or some people have looked at that, and it's a really great question and exciting field of research.
So what are some of the differences that you'll see in the geology of like the different places that you've studied? Like what different minerals or things will you see in the sediment itself? Yeah,
so the different mineral differences of the sand, for example, between a place like Bermuda, you can almost see it here if you've been to the Mississippi Gulf Coast, you can see that this looks very different. You know, first of all, we have giant boulders here along the coast. In Bermuda, for example, we have reefs, which are calcium carbonate. So this is almost all of the sediment and minerals, essential, if you want to think about it, that you see in this image is almost all calcium carbonate. What you see along the Mississippi Gulf Coast, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, is almost all silica. So it's silicious. In Japan, which is one of the other sites that I've, one of the places that I've worked, the sand grains and mineral grains are going to be all volcanic. So, igneous and sedimentary rocks there as kind of differences. And so a lot of it has to do, so you might ask, well, why is that difference? And a lot of it is related to the geology. But I think it's also kind of really interesting. So Bermuda is an island that's really far away from any rivers, like it's literally right in the middle of the ocean. And so the only sediment that it has is essentially sediment that is made from organisms. We call that biogenic. So that's what the calcium carbonate is. It's actually limestone that is formed from critters living in the reef, from the reef itself. And then that reef actually breaks down because of hurricanes and makes this sand. So that's like the black stuff here is the reef, and then the white stuff is the sand, but it kind of looks like this in cross section. And so that's the only reason that there's sediment in Bermuda is because of that. So, that's kind of something to think about. Whereas the water is nice and clear, and so you can have reefs there. In Mississippi, the water is so turbid, meaning that it's filled with sediment, that light attenuation is pretty high, and we don't really have reefs, at least not the same kind of coral algal reefs that we have in these more clearer environments. But the geology is kind of playing a big role as well.
So those organisms will then kind of like recycle that calcium, and then like new organisms will kind of use it.
Once it's sand, you mean?
Yes.
Kind of. So basically the organisms in the reef, as the reef is building, they're actually getting the calcium, and making carbonate from the seawater itself. Okay. So once it forms, that rock and it breaks apart, it just starts getting smaller and smaller and smaller particles, but it'll always kind of be there unless it dissolves. It actually has to dissolve back into the water for it to be available for, other organisms to actually take it back out of the water. And there is a process that is happening right now, which is leading to the dissolution of calcium carbonate around the planet in the oceans. And that process is ocean acidification, which is, largely due to humans. We're pumping all of the CO2 into the planet, into the atmosphere, which is a greenhouse gas. And one of the places that it goes is it goes from the atmosphere into the ocean, and causes it to acidify. So just like I actually have some mineral water right here because I like to drink it. I don't know if you can see the bubbles in it. You see my bubbles? It is, it's CO2 that they've injected into the water. And that's the same thing that's happening in the, in the ocean. But if I put a bunch of calcium carbonate, if I put a shell in here, small shells, I'm sure, because it's not that acidic because we're drinking it. But, it's going to eventually dissolve back into the water. And that's how it kind of gets recycled,
Right. We talked about ocean acidification yesterday in our chemical oceanography lesson, so it's good that you tied that in there. So no ideas on how long that process takes for that calcium that's in the sand to eventually dissolve into the seawater?
Yeah, it is entirely dependent on how acidic the water is. So if it's if the water's really, really acidic, it doesn't really take that long, if the waters are really acidic. And in fact, I'm not sure if you talked about this or not in the class, but, ocean acidification is such a massive problem right now that coral reefs are certainly within the lifetime of everybody that's on the call, there's a very strong possibility that they're going to be completely gone in the planet. A very strong possibility. Like that's something in our lifetimes that we should expect to see, coral reefs going completely extinct. And the reason for that is for no other reason. I mean, there's lots of reasons why, but if you just look at ocean acidification, that is enough to that is enough to completely get rid of them. You know what I mean? Which is really sad because they're really important ecosystems,
Right.
and they form all of these habitats and are really important for a number of different reasons, for nurseries to for smaller fish to all sorts of kind of food chain dynamics and stuff like that. But there are geological oceanographers to tie that back in that study just reefs. And to be quite honest with you, one of the things that's on my bucket list, Galen, to do is to go to the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, in part because it's wonderful, but there's a very strong possibility, like in a couple of decades, it'll be completely gone.
Right.
So see it while you can, because it'll be gone. I mean, that's just crazy to think about, but it's true.
I know they were doing some genetic studies from the deep sea corals and trying to see how they were surviving in just a different type of water quality and in no sunlight. I think they were trying to see if they could potentially use that those genes to help with the Great Barrier Reef. I don't know the end result of that study, but that was one field of research that was being pursued.
Yeah.
All right.
It is an active field for sure.
Yeah. Do we have any other questions for Dr. Davin Wallace? Doesn't look like it. All right, well, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to all of our participants as well for being here. We've had a really good week. We've learned a lot about the ocean, and we hope that you are able to learn something too, and that you can follow us on our Instagram page or our Facebook page as well. Just look for Gulf Coast Research Lab Marine Education Center. But thank you so much, Davin, for being here, and best of luck to you and your family.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yes.
Have a good weekend. Bye.
You too. Bye, guys.